There are nights, my literature-loving friends, when a city feels like it is breathing in a strange rhythm, slow, heavy, almost mournful. Streetlights flicker like tired guardians, shadows fold over sidewalks like unspoken confessions, and somewhere deep inside the machinery of urban life, a man walks quietly, almost invisibly, carrying storms that no one else can see. That is the emotional doorway through which this film invites us, presenting violence not as spectacle but as a consequence of moral mathematics, and presenting justice not as a system but as a personal technology deployed by someone who has nothing left to lose. In 2014, Hollywood packaged that emotional and psychological tension into a sleek, commercially viable action thriller built around the same economic principles that drive Silicon Valley product cycles: clear value proposition, sharp differentiation, and an instantly recognizable hero brand. The Equalizer, 2014, emerged not just as a movie but as a financial and engineering experiment disguised as a revenge narrative, one where every punch, every pause, every flick of a stopwatch is choreographed to feel like the calibration of a machine rediscovering its purpose. At its core, the story introduces us to a quiet man living an intentionally ordinary life, a man whose meticulous routines feel like they're stitched together from trauma, discipline, and an unspoken desire to disappear into anonymity. He wakes up early. He measures his time. He eats alone. He works at a hardware store that is less a workplace and more a buffer between him and the past. Everything about him feels like a negotiation with memory. But when he befriends a young girl trapped in violence and exploitation, that negotiation collapses. Moral neutrality becomes impossible. And what follows is not a transformation, but a reactivation of an old operating system, a dormant mechanism of violence and strategy suddenly switching back on. For the studio, this premise had immediate commercial logic. A hero who is quiet, restrained, and hyper-competent appeals to global markets across language and cultural barriers. A plot centered on justice, revenge, and ordinary environments reduces production cost while maximizing relatability. And anchoring the story on Denzel Washington creates a reliability multiplier. Studios know his films perform consistently across demographics, with strong legs in both theatrical and home streaming markets. The production budget, estimated in the range of $55 to $60 million, was a calculated gamble, small enough to minimize risk, but large enough to fund stylized action, high-contrast cinematography, and controlled set pieces that feel intimate yet operatically tense. Investor strategy likely followed the low-risk/high-repeat model. Build a franchise potential character whose emotional architecture can sustain sequels without requiring heavy CGI or expensive world building. In other words, create a human IP instead of a universe IP. Tech ambition played its own role. This was a film engineered around practical effects and kinetic timing rather than large-scale digital environments. The violence is not chaotic. It is measured, almost algorithmic. The camera moves with the certainty of a tool following a blueprint. Lighting leans into noir minimalism, enhancing shadows as emotional variables. Even the color palette functions like psychological coding: cold blues for restraint, tungsten warmth for moments of moral clarity, desaturated urban textures for the world's indifference. In the broader Hollywood ecosystem of 2014, the film arrived at an interesting inflection point. Superhero franchises were dominating the marketplace. CGI-heavy blockbusters were swallowing release calendars. And within that competitive environment, studios were hungry for grounded action thrillers that could deliver high ROI without competing in the same budget bracket as Marvel or Warner Brothers. That is where this film found its market advantage, offering realism as its special effect, silence as its spectacle, and human psychology as its box office hook. Narratively, the brief plot setup is elegantly simple, almost minimalist. A solitary man with a buried past meets a vulnerable girl, witnesses violence inflicted upon her, tries resolving it peacefully, but when the system proves inadequate, he steps outside it. This is an emotional contract with the audience, one that promises transformation without melodrama, action without chaos, and justice without ambiguity. The premise is not new. Hollywood has been crafting lone warrior justice narratives for decades. But what differentiates this one is its emotional tonality. It is slower, quieter, more introspective, almost poetic in the way it treats danger as a psychological mirror rather than an external threat. Industry context strengthens this further. Denzel Washington rarely plays franchise characters. Studios knew that if this worked, it would unlock a multi-film runway built on prestige performance instead of spectacle. Director Antoine Fuqua, known for kinetic realism, brought a brand of muscular filmmaking that blends grit with atmospheric elegance. Their partnership had already proven commercially potent in training day, making this reunion a financially strategic decision. The first step in any cinematic product lifecycle is emotional positioning, deciding what the film feels like before it decides what it says. This film positions itself as a meditation on justice wrapped inside a consumer-friendly action thriller. Its emotional architecture is built on quiet tension, moral weight, and the sense that violence here is not entertainment but an unavoidable economic cost of protecting innocence. That tonal decision is what allowed the movie to cross from emotional storytelling into financial success, giving its investors the confidence that this was not just a film but a durable, repeatable cinematic asset. There is a certain calm, my literature-loving friends, that only exists right before a life begins to change, an almost fragile quietness that sits between routine and revelation. The early moments of this film embody that fragile space with such gentle precision that you barely realize how much groundwork is being laid. The story walks with the same silent discipline as the man at its center, building tension the way a startup builds early prototypes. Quietly, methodically, and without announcing its intention to reshape the market it is about to enter. These opening passages introduce us to a man who seems to have perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. His life is a minimalist sculpture carved out of routine, waking at the same hour, folding his sheets with military geometry, eating alone at a diner where the waitstaff know him only as a polite regular, and spending his days at a hardware store where he trains a younger co-worker with almost fatherly patience. Each gesture is economical, each movement optimized like a system running on low-power mode. It is life lived as controlled performance. Yet beneath the stillness, there is an unmistakable tremor of something more, trauma perhaps, or a past that was never fully buried. In narrative terms, these early scenes are the equivalent of a startup's research and development phase. The film is prototyping its emotional hardware, establishing user familiarity, testing audience empathy, and building the promise of transformation. Everything feels intentionally slow, like a product testing its stability before scaling into intensity. And in that process the audience becomes an investor, not of money but of attention and emotional bandwidth. We invest because we sense that this man's silence is not emptiness but compression, like a spring held down by past violence and unresolved morality. The plot's first real pivot occurs at the diner, that gentle liminal space where dreams and despair gather under late-night neon. It is here where our quiet protagonist meets a young girl working under the control of men far more powerful and cruel than she should ever have encountered. Their interactions are tender in a way that feels almost accidental, an unlikely friendship formed through small talk, shared books, and the unspoken recognition of pain. For the narrative, this is where emotional investment goes from passive to active. The girl humanizes the man, she activates the audience's moral calculus. She becomes the spark in the prototype that reveals the potential energy hidden beneath the surface. When she is beaten and hospitalized, the story undergoes its first major acceleration, a shift from observational drama to kinetic moral momentum. This is the startup's transition from prototype to pre-launch phase, where pressure builds and the emotional stakes crystallize. Our protagonist tries at first to resolve the situation peacefully. He approaches the men responsible, offering money for the girl's freedom with a quiet dignity that feels almost ancient, as if he is appealing to their humanity before appealing to his own capacity for destruction. It is a negotiation attempt, a non-violent minimum viable product, so to speak. But the men refuse, dismissing him with arrogance that is cinematic, psychological, and economic. Their refusal is not just a rejection of his offer, it is a rejection of the possibility that this quiet stranger could ever be a threat. And in that miscalculation the narrative undergoes its second pivot. The silent system finally switches modes. The dormant skill set is reactivated. The man who spent the film's first act hiding from his capabilities now begins to inhabit them with an almost algorithmic clarity. The ensuing confrontation is not loud or chaotic. It is precise, intimate, and executed with the cold efficiency of a machine returning to its original programming. The camera stays close, the lighting tight, the rhythm controlled. Violence is not spectacle here. It is data, calculated, optimized, and delivered with ruthless minimalism. It is the completion of the startup's emotional prototype. Now the audience fully understands the product they are watching, the man they are following, and the price of provoking him. What makes this first half so compelling is how it balances emotional storytelling with operational design. We watch the man not as a superhero but as a former system, built, trained, and weaponized, trying to function in a civilian environment. His restraint is a form of cost management. His silence is risk mitigation. His mentorship of his coworker is human capital investment. Everything he does reflects a tension between who he has decided to be and who he once was constructed to become. As the first half closes, the narrative widens its aperture. Killing the men who controlled the girl does not resolve the problem, it escalates it. The violence sends shockwaves through a criminal network structured like a corporation. One with departments, hierarchies, and a CEO who does not tolerate disruption. Every action the hero takes becomes a trigger, sending the plot into the scaling phase where the stakes grow exponentially, and the cost of moral intervention becomes both personal and systemic. The first half ends like the moment before a market launch. The quiet before the noise, the breath before the storm. Our protagonist has crossed an invisible threshold. The men who should have been the final obstacle were merely the beginning. The real adversaries are on their way. The emotional ROI of the story is about to increase, the narrative will accelerate, and the calm, disciplined world that the man built for himself is about to confront the consequences of becoming visible again. There comes a moment in every story, my literature-loving friends, when the quiet man who tried so hard to remain invisible is suddenly forced onto the stage of his own destiny. The second half of this film begins right at that threshold, where a simple act of compassion evolves into a chain reaction neither the hero nor the villains can undo. What began as a moral intervention now transforms into a full-scale confrontation with an entire criminal ecosystem, and this shift reflects not just narrative momentum but a kind of emotional economics. When you strike a system, the system strikes back, often with disproportionate force. The Russian syndicate enters this half of the story like a corporate audit triggered by unexpected losses. They are not portrayed as chaotic street criminals. They move with organizational precision. They send a fixer, a man who behaves like an outsourced crisis manager, whose job is not just to restore order but to analyze the disturbance, identify the anomaly, and eliminate it. This antagonist is introduced with a sense of cold intelligence. He studies crime scenes the way a forensic accountant studies fraudulent ledgers, tracing patterns, inconsistencies, and invisible fingerprints back to their source. As soon as he arrives, the film's emotional rhythm changes. The first half was quiet build-up. The second half is balanced escalation. The line between hunter and hunted begins to blur. The fixer senses something unusual about the killings: efficiency, discipline, and a tactical signature that suggests corporate-grade training rather than impulsive rage. For the first time, the criminal network realizes that their opponent isn't a rival gang or disgruntled client. It is something older, colder, and infinitely more methodical. This dynamic creates a kind of emotional product-market tension. The hero, who has kept to a personal moral code, is suddenly forced to scale his actions. His small, isolated intervention is no longer sustainable. The villains responding with force is the narrative equivalent of market pushback, the world recalibrating around a new disruptive presence. And instead of retreating, the hero adapts. The same quiet focus he used to fold bedsheets, measure tea, and train co-workers now becomes the operational backbone of a one-man war against a corporate empire built on fear. The film deepens its emotional stakes by showing how violence, once reactivated, spills beyond the initial target. Innocent people are threatened. A friend is attacked. The hardware store becomes a battlefield in waiting. And in those moments, the narrative communicates an unspoken truth. Once you stand up against the system, the cost is never limited to yourself. The hero recognizes this and chooses to shoulder the burden rather than let others pay it. This willingness to internalize collateral risk is what makes the story feel more like a moral saga than a typical action movie. As the fixer closes in, the story enters its kinetic spiral. Confrontations unfold with increasing speed. The hero moves from defense to offense, analyzing weaknesses in the syndicate's hierarchy like a strategist dismantling a hostile corporation from within. He attacks supply lines, revenue nodes, and operational hubs. Every action is precise, never reckless, always calculated. The pacing feels like a business model scaling through successive rounds. Each encounter a new level of strategic clarity, each decision a test of both resilience and purpose. This escalation leads into one of the film's most atmospheric sequences: the showdown at the hardware store. It is a brilliant piece of narrative engineering, turning an ordinary workplace into a labyrinth of improvised weapons and environmental advantages. In business terms, this is a perfect demonstration of tactical resource utilization, using existing assets to neutralize a better-equipped adversary. Tools, lighting, aisles, and machinery become extensions of the hero's skill set. The environment transforms into a character itself, amplifying tension while grounding the action in realism. This scene also completes one of the story's emotional arcs. Earlier, the hardware store symbolized the hero's attempt at a quiet, civilian life, a place of calm repetition and normalcy. By turning it into a battleground, the film visually communicates the truth he has been avoiding. He cannot fully escape what he once was. Peace requires more than withdrawal, it requires resolution. And the resolution begins with eliminating the source of threat at its root. The narrative then shifts toward its final act, where the hero travels directly to the syndicate's leadership. This is the plot's version of market release, where the full product of his abilities is finally revealed. The corporate headquarters of the criminals is cold, illuminated by sterile light and structured like the command center of a multinational empire. The confrontation is inevitable, not explosive. And when it happens, it feels like the closing of a ledger. Old debts paid, threats neutralized, balance restored. What makes this second half so effective is that it never rushes. It honors the emotional logic of the story. Each action is a consequence of an earlier seed planted in the first half. Each confrontation feels like an ethical invoice being collected. And each moment of violence carries the weight of someone who does not enjoy cruelty but understands necessity. By the time the final scene arrives, the transformation is complete. Not a shift from weakness to strength, but from avoidance to acceptance. The man who wanted anonymity now chooses purpose. The routines continue, but with a different energy, a different clarity. He has become a kind of silent guardian again, walking through the world with the calm, heavy awareness of someone who knows exactly what he is capable of, and exactly where he chooses to direct that capacity. The emotional product-market fit of the film becomes clear here. Audiences respond not just to the violence, but to the quiet moral conviction behind it. We do not watch him because he is unstoppable. We watch him because he is disciplined, principled, and deeply human beneath his lethal precision. The story's second half converts narrative risk into emotional reward, leaving us with a strange mix of tension, catharsis, and a lingering sense of reflection about what justice costs when systems fail to deliver it. There is something quietly haunting, my literature-loving friends, about watching a man who has spent years trying to disappear suddenly confronted with the truth that parts of him were never meant to rest. In this story, character psychology operates like a slow-burning fuse, quiet, almost invisible at first, but carrying immense emotional charge beneath its stillness. The hero moves like someone negotiating with his own history, each gesture revealing the tension between who he wants to be and who he was engineered to become. In behavioral economics, we might call this an internal battle between present bias and sunk cost identity, but emotionally it feels far simpler. A man trying to choose peace in a world that keeps demanding violence. His routine-heavy lifestyle in the film's opening is not mere habit. It is trauma-informed self-regulation. Every perfectly folded bedsheet, every precisely timed tea ritual, every early morning walk is a form of cognitive discipline designed to keep his past from reawakening. Trauma survivors often cling to predictability because it is the only environment where their nervous system feels manageable. For him, routine is not comfort. It is containment. It's the emotional equivalent of locking dangerous tools in a drawer and hoping the drawer never needs to be opened again. But this containment has a cost. Behavioral economists would call it opportunity cost. The emotional opportunities sacrificed in exchange for psychological safety. He avoids deep relationships, avoids unpredictability, avoids anything that might trigger the version of himself he fears. This is a man who has mastered emotional austerity. He spends as little of himself as possible, rationing connection, limiting expression, keeping life narrow because narrowness feels safe. Yet even within that minimalism, traces of compassion leak through, helping a coworker lose weight, cheering him on during tests, offering kindness to strangers. These small investments foreshadow something deeper, the quiet desire to matter again. That desire becomes clear when he meets the young girl. She is, in psychological terms, a projection surface, a mirror reflecting not who he is, but who he once promised to be. Her vulnerability activates his most deeply buried instincts: protect, intervene, repair. From a behavioral perspective, this is the moment where his moral utility curve overwhelms his risk avoidance model. He is someone who once lived inside a system of sanctioned violence. Now he is faced with a situation where violence is being used against the powerless. The emotional contradiction becomes unbearable. He cannot claim neutrality without betraying the part of himself that believes in balance, fairness, and justice. This is where the opportunity cost of conscience becomes impossible to ignore. If he stays silent, he loses himself. If he intervenes, he loses his anonymity and risks reopening a life he deliberately closed. Either choice has a price. That psychological tension threads through his every decision, giving his actions a kind of moral gravity rarely seen in standard action protagonists. He is not fighting because he enjoys violence. He is fighting because the alternative would violate the ethical architecture he still carries deep inside. The fixer, his counterpart, embodies the opposite psychology. He represents pure rational aggression, violence without conscience, strategy without empathy, efficiency without morality. If our hero's behavior aligns with a constrained optimization model, the antagonist is pure profit maximization in human form. He engages problems the way a corporation engages market threats. Analyze, isolate, neutralize. He is what happens when intelligence is stripped of compassion, when behavioral economics loses the behavioral and keeps only the economics. This dynamic makes their conflict feel less like good versus evil and more like two competing models of human decision-making. The villain calculates risk through an external lens: power, money, reputation. The hero calculates risk internally: peace, conscience, self-alignment. It is a battle between internal harmony and external dominance. One seeks emotional balance, the other seeks organizational control. The brilliance of the character psychology lies in how the film uses silence. Our hero speaks little, but every pause is loaded with emotional metadata. In those breaths between words, you sense the moral weight he carries, the discipline required to keep the past suppressed, and the growing inevitability that he will need to step back into the identity he abandoned. Silence becomes a psychological diagnostic tool, revealing the pressure building inside him long before he acts on it. This internal tension deepens when innocent people are threatened. Behavioral economics teaches us that humans are loss-averse. We fear losing far more than we value gaining. For him, the greatest loss would be failing to protect others when he knows he can. His violence is not motivated by rage but by loss prevention, preventing the world from losing innocence, preventing the girl from losing her future, preventing his co-workers from losing their safety. This is moral loss aversion transformed into action. His final evolution becomes clear in the story's climax. Once he accepts that peace cannot be sustained by hiding, his psychology shifts. He stops treating his capabilities as liabilities and begins treating them as responsibilities. In business language, this is a pivot from defensive posture to mission-driven execution. Emotionally, it is a reconciliation between his past and present selves. He is no longer the man running from who he was. He is the man finally integrating that identity into a purposeful, ethical framework. This is why the character resonates so deeply. He proves that strength without cruelty is possible, that discipline can coexist with empathy, and that violence, when channeled through conscience, becomes a tool rather than a curse. He is a portrait of moral engineering, someone whose psychological architecture shows how trauma, ethics, and training can fuse into a kind of reluctant heroism. What we learn from him is simple yet profound. Justice, when the world fails to deliver it, becomes a personal economic choice. And some people, built the way he is built, will always choose to pay the price themselves rather than let the innocent bear it. There is always a moment, my literature-loving friends, when a film stops being a story and reveals itself as a financial organism. A structure of risks, capital flows, and marketplace strategies wrapped in the illusion of narrative. The beauty of this movie lies partly in how quietly it hides its financial machinery behind its emotional stillness. But if we look closely, we begin to see the fingerprints of accountants, marketers, and executives shaping every shadow, every beat of silence, every burst of violence. In many ways, this was not just a film about justice. It was a $60 million experiment in calibrated brutality, designed with precision to maximize both artistic and economic yield. The production budget, generally reported between $55 to $60 million, reflects a calculated balancing act. Too low, and the film risks looking cheap in a genre that depends on atmosphere, choreography, and stunt coordination. Too high, and it enters the dangerous territory where break-even becomes a gamble rather than a projection. By anchoring the budget in that mid-tier zone, the studio positioned the film perfectly. Expensive enough to look premium, but lean enough that global distribution could pull it into profitability even with moderate domestic performance. This cost structure also speaks to a philosophy in modern Hollywood, the prestige action model. You take a respected actor with global recognition, someone like Denzel Washington, place him in a gritty human-scale world, and build the film around performance and sensation rather than CGI and spectacle. This reduces overhead dramatically. No expensive digital creatures. No massive VFX pipelines. No sprawling set constructions that blow through millions before a single scene is shot. Instead, the cost flows into stunt teams, location control, carefully constructed interiors, and the kind of lighting design that makes ordinary spaces feel operatic. And then there is the Denzel effect. He is not just an actor. He is a global asset with a built-in brand trust index. Studios know that his presence dramatically increases both domestic attendance and overseas appeal, especially in markets where action grounded in realism performs reliably. His salary likely consumed a significant portion of the above-the-line budget, but in ROI terms, it was a strategic investment. Every territory, Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, responds consistently to actors with calm authority and psychological depth. The studio wasn't paying him for flash, they were paying him for dependability. Marketing spend for the film hovered at roughly $35 to $40 million, following a hybrid strategy of digital campaigns, urban outdoor ads, social media teasers, and action-centric trailers designed to highlight silence to explosion tension. The marketing emphasized not just violence but moral gravity. It sold the film as a character-driven action thriller rather than a typical revenge movie, widening its reach to older audiences who generally avoid ultra-violent genre films but trust Denzel Washington to deliver something intelligent. The release strategy brilliantly leveraged timing. Opening in late September, a period not dominated by tentpole blockbusters, the film faced limited competition. This allowed it to stretch out across multiple weekends, benefiting from strong word of mouth. In financial terms, it enjoyed long-tail theatrical viability, meaning it wasn't expected to dominate in the first weekend but to perform consistently over many weeks. And it did. Its opening weekend delivered $34 million domestically, a strong figure relative to its budget. But the real story was its worldwide total, approximately $192 million. That is a 3.2-3.5x multiplier on production cost, which for a non-franchise mid-budget film is exceptional. When you factor in marketing spend, distributor shares, and home distribution revenue, analysts estimate that the film cleared $50 to $70 million in net profit, making it one of the most successful mid-budget action films of its release year. But that is only half the story. Hollywood investors don't just look at one film, they evaluate franchise potential. And this film had a crucial advantage. Its protagonist is an ethically complex man navigating a grounded world. There are no sci-fi constraints, no fantasy rules, no expensive world-building required. This makes sequels exponentially cheaper compared to franchises like Marvel, where budgets escalate naturally with each installment. Investors knew this character could sustain multiple stories without inflating costs. In financial terms, he is scalable without being structurally expensive. The film's distribution strategy also leaned heavily on international markets. Action films with universal themes, resilience, justice, survival, perform extremely well overseas. Dialogue-heavy dramas can struggle, but action travels easily because physicality is a universal language. The studio targeted territories where Denzel Washington's reputation is especially strong. The UK, France, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, and Australia all contributed significantly to the global box office. And then came streaming. The film arrived during the peak era of premium cable and pre-streaming digital purchases. Licensing deals with Starz, later television rights, and international VOD agreements created a long tail of recurring revenue. Action thrillers with strong replay value perform particularly well on streaming because audiences rewatch them for mood, energy, and comfort. That gave the film continuous earnings that extended years beyond its theatrical run. From a financial architecture perspective, the film represents a case study in efficient capital deployment. It invested in talent where it mattered, kept production costs controlled, and leaned on atmospheric realism to deliver the sense of scale normally purchased with expensive effects. It used its marketing budget wisely, showcasing character psychology rather than big explosions. It relied on a release window optimized for its demographic, and capitalized on global markets that consistently support morally driven action films. Even the soundtrack and licensing choices reflected financial intention. Minimal use of expensive needle drops kept costs down, while the score leaned on mood-building rather than orchestra-heavy arrangements that require large recording budgets. This allowed the film to sound big without costing big. The financial poetry of the film lies in its balance, the same balance its protagonist seeks. It is a story of a man who tries to control his internal chaos, mirrored by a production trying to control its financial footprint. In both cases, discipline creates power. Precision creates impact. And restraint becomes the very thing that gives the final product its emotional weight. In the end, the studio didn't just produce a hit, they produced a long-term asset. A character who can continue generating revenue. A world that can expand without inflating costs. A brand that blends moral seriousness with visceral tension. This is the kind of project that Hollywood accountants adore because it offers the one thing the industry rarely guarantees: predictable profit with artistic credibility. There are films, my literature-loving friends, that feel engineered rather than merely assembled, films where every shadow, every frame, every whisper of light has been shaped with the precision of someone tuning an instrument built from glass and circuitry. This is one of those films. Its visual identity is not an accident. It is the result of choices made in the language of lenses, sensor dynamics, color science, and editing pipelines. Watching it feels like watching an orchestra in which every musician is a piece of technology tuned to the quiet, dangerous heartbeat of its protagonist. To understand this film's aesthetic, we must begin with its cameras. The production leaned heavily on ARRI Alexa systems, the gold standard digital cameras whose sensors are revered for their organic contrast roll-off and exceptional low-light performance. The Alexa allows shadows to breathe, to hold texture without collapsing into digital noise, which is essential in a story where danger often emerges from dim rooms, alleyways, and quiet nocturnal spaces. You'll notice the nighttime scenes do not feel artificially brightened or digitally forced. They retain that believable, moody grain of urban reality, which is only possible with sensors capable of capturing a wide dynamic range without sacrificing emotional darkness. The filmmakers paired these cameras with Zeiss Master Prime lenses, known for their sharpness, speed, and color neutrality. These lenses do not romanticize the world. They present it with a kind of disciplined honesty. Faces appear emotionally readable without looking glossy. Backgrounds hold sharpness even in low light, allowing the city to feel grounded rather than stylized. In cinematographic psychology, lenses shape not just what we see but how we feel about what we see. The Master Primes, with their precision and consistency, mirror the protagonist's mindset: controlled, tactical, quietly rigorous. Lighting in the film leans into a hybrid approach between naturalistic practicals and highly controlled setups. The protagonist's world is lit with restraint, cooler tones, tighter contrasts, and practical lamps creating islands of illumination. This is cinematic behavioral coding. Small, controlled pools of light communicate isolation, introspection, and the emotional restraint he imposes upon himself. By contrast, the criminal world glows with harsher lights, fluorescent greens, sodium vapor yellows, the sickly tones of places where corruption festers. The visual palette becomes an emotional map: blue for self-control, gold for vulnerability, green for danger. Color grading, executed through DaVinci Resolve, further sharpens this psychological geography. The grade is cool but not sterile, gritty but not desaturated. Blacks are deep without crushing detail. Skin tones remain natural despite the darker palette, and highlights bloom just enough to give moments of emotional softness. Notice how scenes with the young girl are warmer and more amber-toned, while scenes featuring antagonists lean colder and more metallic. This is emotional coding through color science, an invisible narrative layer that shapes how the audience subconsciously interprets moral energy. The editing pipeline uses Avid Media Composer, the industry standard for narrative features. Avid excels at managing vast quantities of footage while keeping scene continuity precise. This matters because the film's rhythm depends on tension held through silence, and silence is far harder to edit than action. Editing silence requires microcalibration. A half-second too long and the scene drags. A half-second too short and the emotional weight collapses. Avid's timeline precision allows the editor to sculpt these moments like a musician shaping pauses in a symphony. Sound recording employed a blend of boom microphones for environmental realism and lav mics for intimacy. The hero speaks softly throughout the film. His whispers, pauses, and breaths are part of his emotional architecture. Recording them cleanly without noise contamination required careful microphone placement and noise floor management. In audio psychology, breath is as communicative as dialogue. Capturing it authentically amplifies the sense that this man is always measuring, always calculating, always holding back. Action scenes rely heavily on practical effects rather than CGI. The hardware store showdown, for example, is almost entirely practical. Real tools, real lighting fixtures, real impacts. This grounded approach enhances immersion because the audience subconsciously recognizes physical weight and texture that CGI often fails to replicate. Practical effects also align with the protagonist's psychology. He uses the world around him the way a trained engineer uses available tools to solve a problem efficiently. Camera movement is another subtle innovation. Rather than relying on sweeping Steadicam runs or hyperactive shaky cam, The film mostly uses controlled dolly shots, locked-off frames, and deliberate handheld work. Controlled motion communicates emotional stability, handheld motion injects danger. Every movement is intentional. When the protagonist is calm, the camera sits still like a meditation. When violence erupts, the frame shifts into a slightly destabilized mode, but never enough to feel chaotic. This reflects his psychological balance. Chaos arrives, but he does not lose control. One of the film's technological signatures is the stopwatch effect, where the protagonist times his actions with near machine-like precision. The visual representation of this, tight close-ups, ticking sounds, micro-expressions captured in high resolution, relies on high-speed sensors and audio layering inside Pro Tools. The moment he assesses a situation, the film uses microcuts and layered sound design to simulate rapid computational processing. It is filmmaking used as psychological simulation. Aerial shots and establishing frames employ digital stabilization and drone photography, but kept minimal to preserve the grounded tone. These shots give the city a quiet omnipresence, reminding the audience that this story is just one thread in a larger urban ecosystem. They widen the emotional aperture without breaking immersion. Even the choice of aspect ratio, 2.39:1, is psychological. Widescreen gives isolation more breathing room. It allows the protagonist to feel small within empty spaces, emphasizing loneliness. Yet it also provides enough width for action choreography to unfold cleanly without resorting to frantic cuts. Finally, the data workflow behind the scenes, ingesting footage, syncing audio, color management, backup systems, functions like a hidden nervous system. A film built on shadows and subtle lighting requires meticulous metadata tagging, secure backups, and consistent LUT application to prevent shifts in tone. This invisible layer of technology ensures emotional continuity remains intact. In the end, the film's technological identity mirrors its protagonist: precise, disciplined, quietly powerful, and engineered for efficiency rather than spectacle. It proves that innovation in filmmaking doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers through lens choice, breath capture, shadow detail, and the careful blending of analog physicality with digital precision. There's a kind of invisible choreography, my literature-loving friends, that happens long before a camera rolls. A quiet storm of scheduling, budgeting, staffing, and risk calculations that determines whether a film survives the journey from script to screen. Watching this movie with the production lens in mind, you begin to appreciate how much of its calm, moody elegance is the product of logistical discipline. The story may focus on a solitary man living in strict routine, but behind the scenes, hundreds of people were building their own routines to hold the film's emotional clarity together. Production management becomes the unseen architecture supporting the visible narrative. In the world of filmmaking, time is not just money, it is capital, oxygen, and leverage. Every hour on set has a cost, every lighting setup is a micro-investment, every delay accumulates like interest. That's why mid-budget films such as this one must operate with precision. With a budget in the $55 to $60 million range, the production couldn't afford the loose, sprawling shooting schedules that mega blockbusters enjoy. Instead, the studio needed an efficient and highly coordinated operation. The first step in the production pipeline was organizational design. The director, Antoine Fuqua, works with a leadership style built on tight coordination. He prefers clear hierarchy, fast communication, and a tactical chain of command, traits that align perfectly with the disciplined energy of the film itself. Under him, the assistant directors manage day-to-day sequencing, creating shot schedules, estimating camera resets, coordinating departments, and ensuring cast availability. Their job is to think several hours ahead, predicting problems before they disrupt the system. The production shot primarily on real locations rather than sound stages, and that choice comes with economic trade-offs. Real environments save money on set construction but require meticulous logistical planning. Securing permits, negotiating neighborhood disruptions, coordinating night shoots, controlling street noise, and managing unpredictable weather. Each of these variables becomes a line item in both the budget and the daily schedule. For example, night shoots, central to the film's tone, require premium pay rates for crew, transportation coordination, and careful fatigue management. These are not artistic decisions alone. They are industrial ones. To minimize delays, the crew operated with a hybrid scheduling model: block shooting for dialogue sequences and location clustering for action scenes. Block shooting means filming all scenes in a particular location or emotional setting consecutively, even if they appear far apart in the final movie. Location clustering means grouping scenes geographically to reduce travel time and equipment relocation costs. This merges creative flow with financial optimization. The hero's diner scenes, for instance, were filmed over a tightly controlled set of nights, allowing lighting rigs and camera tracks to remain in place for maximum efficiency. Then there's the hardware store, one of the film's central locations. Securing a large commercial space for extended shooting requires complex negotiations. The production must compensate the property owners not just for access but for lost business, utilities, insurance, and post-shoot restoration. Transforming it into a cinematic battlefield, complete with breakaway props, rigged shelves, practical explosions, and fire-controlled zones, required multiple departments working in synchronized layers. Art direction handled the environment, stunts choreographed movement, lighting engineered mood, camera crews determined angles, safety officers ensured compliance. All of this had to fit within tightly managed timelines so the production wouldn't bleed money. The studio's economics behind these decisions depended on a principle called throughput maximization, the idea that each shooting day must produce enough usable footage to justify its cost. For mid-budget action films, the industry benchmark is often 3 to 4 minutes of usable footage per day. Anything less and schedules begin to slip. Anything more and the crew risks burnout or diminished quality. This delicate balance required the production team to plan each day like a mathematical equation, balancing actor availability, stunt readiness, lighting complexity, and equipment loadout. One of the most sensitive aspects of production management was working around Denzel Washington's workflow. As the lead, his availability and rhythm shaped the entire shooting calendar. High-profile actors often have contractual limits on daily hours, turnaround time between shoots, and specific obligations regarding rest and safety. The production team builds a shooting schedule that protects the star's performance quality while also respecting budget limits. When a single actor carries the emotional center of the film, protecting his energy becomes a form of capital preservation. Stunt coordination introduced another layer of logistical complexity. Although the film uses mostly practical action rather than CGI, practical effects require intense planning, safety rigging, multiple rehearsals, pre-visualization, and asset resets between takes. A smashed prop, for example, needs replacements. A blood effect needs cleanup. A lighting fixture that shatters needs reinstalling. Each reset adds time and time adds cost. The production minimized this by using highly trained stunt teams capable of executing sequences cleanly in as few takes as possible, preserving both time and budget. On-set logistics also relied heavily on departmental interdependence. Grip teams needed to rig lighting quickly, electrical departments needed reliable power distribution, camera assistants needed to maintain lens cleanliness in dark, dusty environments, locations managers had to secure new areas without disrupting the shooting flow. Each department is like a node in a corporate network. If one slows down, the entire system experiences latency. The studio economics behind the project also involved careful forecasting. Before filming started, executives modeled several financial scenarios: best case, expected, and worst case revenue projections. These models considered domestic box office, international territories, home entertainment sales, and long-term licensing. A film with a controlled budget and a global star carries significantly reduced investor risk. The studio structured production spending around a predictable return model, ensuring that even moderate box office performance could secure profitability. Moreover, the production schedule was designed to avoid overtime spikes, which are budget killers. In the industry, overtime pay can multiply costs rapidly, especially for union crews. Assistant directors and line producers track this down to the minute, ensuring that high-stress scenes are scheduled earlier in the day and that less complex sequences cushion the back half of the schedule. The producers also played a pivotal role, balancing artistic ambition with financial reality. A producer's job is not to say no, but to ask how and for how much. Every crane shot, every rain machine, every pyro effect has a cost-to-value ratio. The production embraced a strategy of quiet spectacle, using lighting, sound, and performance to create atmosphere rather than relying on large-scale destruction. This artistic choice doubled as an economic strategy, stretching dollars without reducing emotional intensity. By the time filming wrapped, the movie had stayed within manageable financial boundaries, making the studio confident enough in the production team's discipline to greenlight sequels. This is the ultimate measure of economic success, not just profit on the first film, but trust in a sustainable production model. Production management, in the end, mirrors the protagonist himself, quiet, disciplined, efficient, and deeply aware that every decision has a consequence. The unseen organization behind the scenes becomes the structural backbone of the story we see on screen. And through that structure, the film proves that restraint, when handled with intention, can be more powerful than extravagance. There is a strange comfort, my literature-loving friends, in stories that pretend to exist somewhere between myth and documentary, fictional worlds that feel so grounded, so disciplined in their realism, that we begin to treat them as emotional fact. This film lives inside that delicate space. It never claims to be a historical story or a scientific exploration, yet it wears realism like armor. The world it creates is not fantasy. It is a simulation of the quiet violence and corporate organized criminality that lie beneath the surface of many modern cities. From the very first scenes, the film makes a commitment to plausibility. The protagonist is not a superhuman, not a superhero, not someone with impossible abilities. He behaves like someone with training, not like someone with magic. His movements are precise, economical, and consistent with real-world tactical doctrines. This grounded approach reflects research into law enforcement psychology, military special operations, and behavioral profiling. In fact, the way he observes rooms, measuring escape points, identifying threats, scanning hands before faces, mirrors the habits taught in government protective services and intelligence agencies. One of the most believable aspects is his use of everyday objects as weapons. While action films often exaggerate improvised weaponry for flair, this story takes a more scientifically credible approach. Tools, corkscrews, pipes, and even household items behave exactly as physics dictates. There's no superhuman force, no impossible leverage. His combat style relies on anatomical precision, targeting weak points, minimizing exertion, reducing exposure. This is reminiscent of certain real-world martial systems where efficiency outweighs acrobatics. The fights are short, grounded, and brutal, like real encounters, not choreographed fantasies. Another area where the film demonstrates impressive accuracy is its portrayal of psychological trauma. The protagonist's routines, time tracking, ritualistic behavior, avoidance of unpredictability, are characteristics often seen in individuals who have faced prolonged exposure to violence or morally compromising situations. These habits are coping mechanisms rather than quirks. They align with diagnostic patterns for hypervigilance and structured self-regulation observed in military veterans and intelligence operatives. His silence is not stoicism, it is emotional management. Even the pacing of his violence is realistic. In real confrontations, the body acts faster than conscious thought. The film represents this through a blend of microcuts and slowed introspective beats, showing him mentally rehearsing the encounter before it begins. This mirrors a psychological technique called pre-visualization, a cognitive rehearsal pattern used by elite operators to reduce stress responses and improve reaction time. While stylized for cinema, its underlying logic is credible. The criminal structure depicted in the film also reflects real-world organizational models. The Russian syndicate is portrayed not as erratic thugs but as a vertically integrated enterprise. Their behavior mimics multinational corporate hierarchy, clear chains of command, financial enforcement mechanisms, region-specific operations, and specialized contractors brought in to handle internal disruptions. This aligns with documented structures of real organized crime groups who operate using business logic rather than chaotic violence. Even the fixer, the calm, analytical antagonist, feels scientifically accurate. His method of assessing crime scenes without touching anything, identifying patterns in wounds, and modeling the attacker's profile resembles criminological field analysis. His psychological detachment is typical of individuals trained to function in high-stress environments without emotional interference. He interprets violence not morally but mathematically, turning human suffering into variables in his mental spreadsheet. This detachment is chilling precisely because it reflects the pathology of certain real-world enforcers. The film's urban world is also constructed with documentary-style accuracy. The lighting of streets, the late-night diners, the shabby apartments, and the underground clubs all reflect authentic textures of city life. Its loneliness, its hidden economies, its silent corners where people disappear in plain sight. These spaces aren't fantasy. They're snapshots of the environments where vulnerable individuals often slip through the cracks of society. The film's depiction of exploitation, coercion, and systemic neglect aligns with forensic reports and sociological studies on urban trafficking networks. However, the film does make certain dramatic concessions. While the protagonist's skills are grounded in realism, his survivability borders on mythic. Real tactical operators, no matter how skilled, face unpredictable variables, weapon jams, physical fatigue, environmental hazards, and emotional stress. The film glosses over some of these friction points to maintain narrative flow. His ability to engage multiple armed opponents with improvised weapons stretches plausibility, though not to the degree of fantasy action. It is heightened realism rather than impossibility. The chain reaction he triggers, one man dismantling a multinational criminal business, is also narratively convenient. In reality, criminal organizations rarely crumble from isolated acts of violence. They restructure, reassign roles, reallocate capital. Yet the film compresses this process for emotional payoff. This is where realism bends to the requirements of storytelling. The narrative needs a sense of closure that real criminal systems rarely provide. Scientifically, the film respects physical logic. Weapons behave realistically. Blood loss, impact force, and environmental hazards are not exaggerated beyond recognition. When he uses tools or pressure points, the injuries inflicted reflect anatomical fact rather than cinematic fantasy. The film's violence is not hyper-stylized. It is deliberately uncomfortable because it mirrors real harm rather than aesthetic spectacle. The hardware store climax, for example, showcases creative but physically plausible uses of the environment. Every improvised trap and maneuver follows logical mechanical principles. Shelving units behave as steel structures do. Tools perform within their real torque and sharpness limits. Electrical arcs and water interactions follow basic physics, demonstrating thoughtful coordination between stunt choreography and technical advisors. The film also avoids glamorizing technology. It treats devices, tools, and weapons as ordinary functional objects, not as gadgets in a spy thriller. This grounding enhances the sense of proximity, as if this world could exist just a few streets away from our own. The creative choice to rely on practical effects instead of exaggerated CGI reinforces this documentary realism, making the violence carry emotional weight rather than fantasy detachment. Most importantly, the film's moral landscape reflects a harsh truth seen in real investigative reports. When official systems fail to protect the vulnerable, violence often fills the vacuum. That is the emotional realism at the heart of the film. Its world feels accurate because it is anchored in the same uncomfortable truths that exist in many urban environments, truths about power, neglect, coercion, and the cost of intervention. In the end, the film's historical and scientific accuracy is not about facts or dates but about texture, and authenticity of feeling. It presents a world where systems break, where individuals fall through cracks, where predators disguise themselves as businessmen, and where the quietest man in the room might carry the heaviest history. Its realism doesn't claim to reflect the world exactly, but it certainly reflects the world we wish more people paid attention to. There is a certain poetry, my literature-loving friends, in the way a camera listens to a quiet man's life. In films like this, cinematography becomes more than an artistic choice. It becomes a psychological language. Every pool of light, every stretch of shadow, every corridor lined with darkness feels like a sentence written about the protagonist's inner world. The visual engineering of this film is built around restraint, images constructed not to impress the viewer, but to quietly reshape the viewer's emotional chemistry. The cinematographer approaches this story with a philosophy of minimal intrusion. Instead of filling the frame with spectacle, he fills it with precision. The widescreen 2.39:1 aspect ratio allows the film to breathe horizontally, giving solitude an almost architectural dimension. The extra width creates negative space around the protagonist, amplifying his quietness. He walks through empty aisles, lonely apartments, and rain-washed streets that seem to swallow him whole. In psychological terms, the frame itself becomes a metaphor for isolation. Lens choice plays a crucial role in sculpting this emotional geography. As mentioned earlier, the production used Zeiss master primes, lenses celebrated for their lack of distortion, edge-to-edge sharpness, and near-clinical accuracy in rendering details. These lenses don't romanticize. They reveal. They let us see the tiny micro-expressions, the controlled breathing, the soft tension in the hero's shoulders as he evaluates a room. In a story centered on a man who notices everything, the camera must notice like he does, quietly, efficiently, without ornamentation. The lenses act as a psychological proxy for his mind. But the brilliance of the cinematography lies in its dynamic range discipline. The film is dark, intentionally so, but not murky. Shadows retain depth. Blacks hold texture. Highlights bloom gently but never overpower. This balance allows the viewer to navigate emotional darkness without losing coherence. It is a film shot for the human eye, not for the algorithmic sharpness of modern action blockbusters. Darkness here is not a stylistic flourish, It is emotional data encoding trauma, memory, and moral weight. Lighting design deepens this emotional coding. The protagonist's personal spaces, his home, the diner, are lit softly with practical lights creating warm halos that feel intimate but lonely. The hardware store is cool, industrial, defined by overhead fluorescents that carve sharp geometric patterns across aisles and tools. The criminal world is rendered in sickly greens and cold blues, a visual fingerprint of corruption. These color temperatures create subconscious emotional gradients. Warm light signals humanity, cold light signals threat. The audience doesn't need to be told where danger flows, the light already speaks. Composition also acts as storytelling architecture. The cinematographer uses symmetry to reflect the protagonist's rigid discipline. Scenes of him preparing tea, making his bed, or sitting in the diner are framed with almost mathematical centrality. Everything feels measured. Even his posture fits the geometry of the frame. But when violence erupts, the symmetry breaks. Frames become slightly off balance. The world tilts with tension. This subtle shift mirrors the character's internal transformation from stillness to controlled chaos. One of the most visually telling choices is the use of slow push-ins, the camera gliding forward almost imperceptibly as the protagonist contemplates action. These movements mimic the sensation of being drawn into his mind. The world seems to lean toward him as he makes decisions. This is psychological cinematography. The environment reacts to the character's emotional calculus. In contrast, scenes involving antagonists often employ wide static shots. The world observes them without intimacy, without empathy. Their violence is shown with more emotional distance, as if the camera itself refuses to enter their psychological space. This distinction creates an ethical hierarchy through optics. We understand the protagonist emotionally, we analyze the villains clinically. The film also employs shallow depth of field strategically. In moments where the hero focuses intensely, scanning a room, evaluating threats, reading someone's body language, the background softens, isolating details. His perception becomes our perception. This technique simulates selective attention, a cognitive mechanism sharpened through special operations training. Cinematography here functions like applied psychology. Color grading in post-production amplifies this emotional engineering. Using DaVinci Resolve, colorists sculpted a world where blues dominate, not in a cartoonish way but in a melancholic way. Blues are associated with introspection, restraint, and moral contemplation. Warmth appears only when humanity surfaces. During conversations, moments of vulnerability, small acts of kindness. The palette shifts with emotional truth. The fight sequences are carefully engineered through optical physics rather than excessive editing. Instead of chaotic shaky cam, the cinematographer holds the frame, letting the audience feel the weight and speed of movement. Controlled handheld motion creates just enough instability to simulate danger without sacrificing clarity. This respects the intelligence of the viewer. The action is legible, meaningful, and grounded in physical realism. The hardware store climax is perhaps the film's most impressive visual engineering feat. Lighting rigs were layered to mimic industrial fluorescence while giving the camera enough exposure flexibility. Reflective surfaces, metal tools, polished floors, glass, were managed to avoid unwanted flares and maintain visual coherence. Every tool becomes a potential weapon, and the lighting makes sure the audience sees each one clearly. This transforms an ordinary environment into a tactical maze, not through spectacle but through clarity of design. Even the rain scenes are engineered for emotional effect. Rain softens the frame, diffuses light, and creates reflective textures on pavement, textures that mirror the protagonist's internal turbulence. Rain is cinematic shorthand for cleansing, tension, and transformation. Here, it becomes the environmental equivalent of a deep exhale before violence. Camera placement is another silent storyteller. The camera rarely looks down on the protagonist. It meets him at eye level, even in moments of vulnerability, signaling respect. But villains are often framed from lower angles, emphasizing their arrogance, or from higher angles, reducing their moral stature. This isn't just visual flair, it is moral geometry using verticality to signal ethical position. One of the film's most subtle innovations is the use of negative space as emotional tension. Empty rooms, open doorways, long aisles, they all create anticipation. The protagonist thrives in emptiness because emptiness allows control. The villains crumble in emptiness because emptiness exposes them. The cinematography understands this psychology and shapes space accordingly. Ultimately, the film's visual engineering is a study in disciplined restraint. It proves that cinematography doesn't need to shout to be powerful. It can whisper, observe, and illuminate the soul of a character through shadow and light, through geometry and color, through silence and motion. This visual discipline mirrors the protagonist's emotional discipline, creating a harmony between character and craft that elevates the entire cinematic experience. There are films, my literature-loving friends, where silence becomes a language, where a faint breath or the soft scrape of a chair across a floor carries more tension than 1,000 explosions. This movie resides in that rare category. Its soundscape is engineered not for spectacle but for psychological intimacy. It speaks to the viewer the way the protagonist himself does, softly, carefully, with the calm intensity of someone who observes before acting. When we look beneath the storytelling, we discover that the sound design is one of the most sophisticated components of the film's architecture, functioning like an emotional operating system. The audio engineers approached the film with a philosophy of precision before volume. Instead of overwhelming the audience with noise, they sculpt sound with the same discipline the hero uses to measure time. His world is quiet, and so the film becomes quiet. Yet that quietness is layered, textured, and expertly controlled through a mixing architecture built inside Avid Pro Tools, the industry standard for high-end sound post-production. The first thing one notices is dynamic range, the emotional contrast between silence and sound. Most modern action films compress their audio, making everything uniformly loud. But here the engineers embrace contrast. They give quiet moments true quiet. You hear the hum of a fluorescent bulb, the rustling of pages in a book, the distant echo of traffic outside the diner. These small sounds are recorded with hyperclarity using high-end boom microphones and lavaliers engineered for low noise capture. Silence becomes an asset. It sets the emotional baseline so that when violence erupts, it feels seismic. This dynamic range mirrors the protagonist's psychology. He lives in stillness. But inside that stillness resides enormous potential energy. The sound design honors this duality. When he shifts from observation to action, the mix tightens, compresses, accelerates, like a heartbeat suddenly rising. The audience feels his internal transformation not because the film tells us, but because the soundscape changes around him. Spatial design is one of the film's most elegant choices. The audio team uses 5.1 surround mixing to place sound strategically in the room. Distant footsteps slide into the rear speakers. Metal clinks echo from the right. A low, ominous rumble creeps beneath dialogue, subtly informing the audience that something dangerous is approaching. This technique, known as psychoacoustic positioning, allows the environment to become a character. You feel inside the hardware store, inside the diner, inside the villain's sterile offices. The world envelopes you. Every environment is given its own acoustic fingerprint. The diner is warm and intimate. Soft clattering dishes, low murmurs, neon hums. The hardware store is brighter, sharper. Metal on metal, hollow aisles, the faint buzz of industrial lighting. The criminal world is colder, digital tones, mechanical noises, low-frequency drones that sound like the breathing of a machine. These acoustic signatures create emotional associations. Warmth equals safety. Coldness equals threat. The audience navigates danger subconsciously through sound. The stopwatch moments are masterpieces of auditory engineering. When the protagonist sizes up a situation, time seems to dilate. The mix pulls certain frequencies forward, breathing, rustling clothes, small mechanical clicks, while pulling ambient noise backward. Reverbs tighten. Bass frequencies rise just enough to signal adrenaline. It's a blend of Foley artistry and digital processing, simulating the focus of a highly trained mind analyzing a room. In these sequences, the sound is not just supporting the visuals, it is narrating the thought process of a man who calculates danger with the speed of a machine. The Foley team deserves special recognition. They recreate every small sound physically, boots stepping on gravel, knuckles brushing against wood, the subtle friction of cloth when the protagonist shifts his stance. These sounds may seem invisible, but they create realism. Without them, the film would feel sterile. With them, it feels tactile, grounded, alive. The Foley work here is emotionally aligned with the film's tone. Naturalistic, restrained, clean. Then there is the music, composed with a philosophy of tension, minimalism, and emotional subtlety. The score blends electronic elements with orchestral shadows, creating a sound world that mirrors the protagonist's duality, mechanical precision fused with human vulnerability. Synth pads create atmospheric blankets that sit beneath scenes like fog. Soft percussive pulses mimic the rhythm of a heartbeat. Strings enter sparingly, usually during moments of moral clarity or emotional connection. One of the most effective musical techniques here is the use of low-frequency oscillation, barely audible pulses that create subconscious tension. You may not consciously hear them, but you feel them in your chest. This is a psychological trick often used in horror or thriller cinema, where anxiety is induced through frequencies the brain interprets as danger. In this film, it becomes the sonic embodiment of the protagonist's suppressed violence. The composers also employ a technique known as negative scoring, choosing not to add music where audiences expect it. In moments of brutality, the score often falls silent, letting the sound design carry the emotional weight. This makes the violence feel more intimate, more real. Music would detach us from the moment. Silence forces us to confront it. Conversely, the music blooms in moments of quiet humanity, when the protagonist talks to the young girl, comforts his co-workers, or walks home through dimly lit streets. Here, soft melodic fragments appear, simple, almost fragile themes. These cues remind the audience that beneath the lethal precision is a man longing for connection and redemption. The music becomes a moral compass. Mixing is where all these components merge into a cohesive whole. The re-recording mixers treat each element, dialogue, foley, ambience, score, as layers in an emotional equation. Dialogue sits forward, clear but not overpolished. Ambience is allowed to breathe. Foley slides in at intimate volumes. The score never overwhelms. Everything is calibrated to maintain emotional honesty. The philosophy behind this mix is clear. Sound as immersion, not distraction. The engineers are not trying to impress the viewer, they are trying to place the viewer inside a man's psyche. The mix reflects discipline. It reflects restraint. It reflects quiet strength. It reflects the film's belief that the loudest truths are often spoken in whispers. In the end, the sound design becomes an extension of the protagonist himself. It watches. It listens. It moves with intention. It attacks with precision. And it leaves behind a lingering echo, a reminder that sound, like justice in this film, does not need to shout to change everything it touches. Marketing a film like this, my literature-loving friends, is an art form that sits somewhere between psychology and economics. It is not simply the act of announcing a release date or dropping a trailer. It is a strategic campaign aimed at shaping audience expectations, controlling perception, and maximizing emotional engagement across demographics. This film succeeded financially not only because of its narrative strength, but because its marketing strategy understood the psychology of its viewers with remarkable clarity. At the heart of the campaign was a simple truth. Audiences don't just watch action films for explosions, they watch them for the emotion behind the explosion. So the marketing leaned into silence, tension, and moral gravity rather than noise. Trailers opened with stillness. The protagonist sitting in a diner, reading a book, observing the world with quiet intelligence. Only later did the ads reveal the violence, creating a contrast that built curiosity. This approach, studied through trailer testing research, taps into what marketers call anticipation bandwidth, the mental space where audiences imagine possibilities and project their own emotional experiences onto the film. Sony's marketing team used A/B testing to optimize these trailers. One version opened with violence first, the other opened with character. Analytics revealed that character-first cuts yielded higher engagement in 25 to 45 age groups, especially among viewers who had followed the lead actor's dramatic career. Violence-first cuts performed better with younger males aged 16 to 25 but performed worse in international markets where grounded stories resonate more deeply. The studio prioritized the version with emotional buildup, which aligned with the film's tone and maximized cross-demographic appeal. Another key component was demographic mapping. The studio identified three primary audience clusters. Men aged 25 to 49, drawn to grounded action thrillers and actor-driven narratives. General international audiences, markets where justice-driven stories and morally clear protagonists thrive. Adult women aged 30 to 55, a demographic that trusts the lead actor's brand and appreciates character-centric stories over mindless violence. By focusing on these clusters, the marketing avoided the trap of trying to appeal to everyone. Instead, it targeted specific emotional expectations: quiet intensity, moral complexity, and earned violence. Digital campaigns played an enormous role. Sony invested heavily in YouTube pre-roll ads, Facebook teasers, and early-era Instagram clips. These platforms allowed precise targeting. Users who engaged with similar action films, fans of the lead actor, followers of crime thriller pages, and audiences who interacted with trailers for titles like John Wick, Taken, and Safe House. CPM, cost per thousand impressions, efficiency came largely from these micro-targeted ads, which delivered high click-through rates because the content met audience expectations with uncanny alignment. Influencer strategy was subtle but effective. Unlike modern films that rely on TikTok virality, this film's campaign targeted long-form YouTube reviewers, crime thriller commentators, and early podcast critics. Sony provided early screenings to creators whose content skewed toward serious film analysis rather than hype. This approach shaped the narrative around the film's tone. Not just another shoot 'em up, but a mature, character-focused thriller. Influencers discussed its psychological depth, creating a perception of quality before the film even released. The marketing also embraced emotional segmentation. Different ads were created for different emotional triggers. Justice-driven ads focused on the protagonist standing up for the vulnerable. Violence-driven ads highlighted choreography and tactical precision. Atmospheric ads emphasized loneliness, late-night cityscapes, and noir tone. The performance-driven ads highlighted the lead actor's quiet intensity. By rotating these ads strategically across platforms, the campaign ensured the film resonated differently with each audience segment while maintaining a cohesive brand identity. International marketing emphasized universality. Subtitled trailers focused on character clarity rather than dialogue-dependent nuance. Posters in Europe and Asia showcased the protagonist standing alone under a streetlight, a visual metaphor instantly understood by global audiences. Solitude, danger, justice. These posters avoided clutter, relying on minimalist typography to convey sophistication and seriousness. Print and outdoor marketing leaned into the film's noir aesthetic. Billboards used high-contrast imagery, dark backgrounds with single-source lighting, to evoke a sense of mystery. In urban centers, digital billboards displayed short 5-second motion loops. A close-up of the stopwatch, a slow zoom on the protagonist's face, a single line of text. Time to live. Time to kill. This microformat marketing built momentum without overexposure. The release schedule was another masterstroke. By choosing late September, the studio avoided blockbuster competition, allowing the film to dominate its box office weekend. September is known for strong adult-oriented releases that build slow, steady momentum. This positioning helped the film maintain long legs, benefiting from word-of-mouth and repeat viewings. Audience analytics post-release confirmed the strategy's effectiveness. Exit polls revealed that viewers cited character, tone, and emotional intensity more often than action when describing why they enjoyed the film. This validated the marketing approach. The emotional sell was more powerful than the action sell. On social media, engagement spiked among adult viewers who typically skip theatrical releases, showing that the marketing successfully reached lapsed moviegoers by framing the film as thoughtful rather than loud. Interestingly, the marketing also capitalized on the lead actor's brand psychology. He is perceived globally as a moral figure, someone whose characters embody quiet strength and principled action. Ads leaned heavily on close-ups of his face, not smiling, not angry, but observing. This expression became the unofficial brand of the film, a man who sees everything and acts when no one else will. Home release marketing extended the strategy. Trailers for digital and Blu-ray emphasized additional features, behind-the-scenes looks, director's commentary, and breakdowns of fight choreography. These extras appealed to film enthusiasts and boosted sales in the secondary market. Streaming and cable licensing deals were promoted with ads highlighting emotional themes rather than violence, aligning with platforms known for character-driven content. In analyzing audience behavior, the studio discovered that viewers who watched psychologically complex dramas had the highest engagement with ads for this film. So retargeting campaigns were built around users who engaged with titles like Prisoners, Sicario, Gone Girl, and Nightcrawler. This cross-pollination strategy significantly boosted trailer completion rates. What makes this film's marketing remarkable is that it never betrayed the soul of the movie. It didn't masquerade as a blockbuster. It didn't sell spectacle at the expense of tone. It respected the film's quiet intensity and sold the experience as psychological, atmospheric, and morally driven. And audiences rewarded that honesty. In the end, the marketing strategy was both artistic and financial, a fusion of emotional storytelling and data-driven precision. It understood the film's heartbeat and amplified it, turning a grounded character drama into a global hit not by shouting loudly, but by whispering with intelligence. There is always a moment, my literature-loving friends, when a film leaves the hands of its creators and enters the hands of the world. A moment when the story is no longer shaped by cameras and scripts but by perception, expectation, and emotional resonance. This film's reception was shaped by that strange and unpredictable alchemy where critics think with their heads and audiences think with their hearts, and sometimes the two discover they are not speaking the same language. Yet over time, this quiet action thriller carved out a legacy far more durable than its opening weekend reviews ever predicted. Critics approached the film with divided expectations. Some saw it as a character-driven meditation wrapped inside an action narrative, praising its atmosphere, its moral weight, and the performance at its center. Others felt it followed a familiar formula, one man against a criminal empire, and questioned whether its violence was justified by its storytelling. But over time, a curious pattern emerged. While critics gave it moderate scores, audiences embraced it with warmth, excitement, and a sense of moral satisfaction. This divergence is not uncommon. Films centered on stillness, discipline, and psychological precision often resonate more deeply with viewers seeking emotional connection than with critics evaluating structural innovation. Most reviews praised the lead actor's performance as the film's gravitational anchor. His ability to convey danger through silence, compassion through stillness, and calculation through subtle expressions was widely recognized. Critics described him as a force of nature subdued, a storm disguised as calm, and one of the few actors who can communicate threat without raising his voice. His portrayal became the defining element of the film's critical identity, elevating moments that might otherwise have felt conventional. The direction also received appreciation. Critics noted that the filmmaker brought an atmospheric elegance to scenes that could easily have become generic. His use of shadow, pacing, and restrained violence was highlighted as a refreshing contrast to the bombastic style common in contemporary action cinema. Many reviewers pointed out that the film's violence felt purposeful rather than gratuitous, grounded in moral consequence rather than visual spectacle. However, some criticisms focused on pacing. A few reviewers argued that the first half moved slowly, exploring routine and character in ways that deviated from mainstream expectations of the genre. But what some saw as slowness, audiences interpreted as emotional depth, a chance to understand the protagonist beyond his skills, to connect with the loneliness woven into his everyday life. Audience scores tell a different story: high approval ratings, strong word of mouth, and a surge of enthusiasm that surprised even the studio. Viewers responded to the moral clarity, the sense of justice delivered with precision, and the almost mythic image of a quiet man standing against corruption. This emotional connection fueled strong box office legs, proving once again that audience sentiment is often more powerful than critical consensus. As for awards, this film was never positioned as award season material, nor was it engineered for that purpose. Its goals were commercial, emotional, and franchise-oriented rather than Oscar-focused. Action films of this type rarely penetrate major awards categories unless they redefine the genre or introduce revolutionary filmmaking techniques. Yet within action thriller communities and genre-specific circles, the film earned recognition for fight choreography, cinematography, and performance-driven intensity. While it did not collect major awards, it developed something arguably more valuable: cultural durability. What does that mean? Cultural durability is the film's ability to remain relevant, rewatchable, and emotionally satisfying long after its release. It is measured not by trophies but by how audiences return to it, reference it, and integrate it into their personal library of meaningful films. And on that front, this film excelled. Streaming data later revealed that it became a top performer in the scalable action category. Movies that balance violence with emotional grounding and attract viewers who appreciate character-driven stories. Its long-term value also lies in the franchise momentum it created. Sequels were greenlit based on the first film's unexpectedly strong performance and the audience's appetite for more stories centered around this character. Critics often underestimate the power of emotional simplicity and moral clarity in building long-lasting franchises. Viewers crave characters who embody principles they admire, especially in a world that often feels morally ambiguous. This quiet, disciplined protagonist became an icon not because he shouted loudly or performed impossible feats, but because he represented a kind of justice rooted in personal responsibility, a justice rare in modern cinema. In terms of cultural impact, the film influenced a wave of grounded action narratives that focused less on spectacle and more on tactical realism. Its emphasis on improvisation, everyday environments, and human-scale problems contributed to a shift in the action genre away from superhero-style invincibility toward practical, emotionally grounded combat. This repositioning of action films made room for other titles to explore minimalist violence, psychological storytelling, and atmospheric mood. Another aspect of the film's legacy lies in its portrayal of masculinity. It offered a vision of strength that was quiet, controlled, compassionate, and deeply introspective. This resonated with viewers tired of hyper-aggressive hero archetypes. Here was a man who sought peace, who read books, who lived with humility, yet possessed the skills to confront darkness when necessary. The film communicated that strength does not require noise, dominance, or bravado. It is measured not by how loudly one speaks, but by how responsibly one acts. Critics revisiting the film in later years often reassessed it more favorably, acknowledging the depth of its psychological world-building and the precision of its craft. The protagonist's disciplined moral worldview, once dismissed as simplistic, gained recognition for its emotional complexity. The film aged well because it was built on timeless themes: justice, restraint, compassion, and the cost of intervention. From an industry standpoint, the film demonstrated the profitability of mid-budget action cinema, a category often considered risky in a blockbuster-dominated market. It proved that audiences still value stories centered on human skill rather than digital spectacle, and that disciplined craftsmanship can turn a simple premise into a long-term asset. In legacy forecasting, this film holds a stable long-term value. It will continue to attract viewers who seek grounded narratives, emotional tension, and characters whose strength lies in moral conviction. Its sequel strengthened its cultural footprint, and its hero remains one of the most quietly compelling figures in modern action cinema. In the end, the film's legacy is not defined by critics or awards. It is defined by the thousands of people who return to it on quiet nights to find courage, calm, and a strange sense of justice in the story of a man who wanted nothing more than to live quietly but chose to stand up when no one else would. There is a quiet truth, my literature-loving friends, that forms in the spaces between light and shadow, between action and silence, between the man we see on screen and the machinery behind him. This film, in all its stillness and storm, ends up being far more than a story about justice. It becomes a meditation on how art survives inside an industry shaped by technology and capital. A reminder that cinema is not just images and sound, but intention, discipline, and the invisible labor of hundreds of people trying to make us feel something honest. When we step back from the mechanics, from the budgets and workflows and marketing analytics, we begin to see the fuller shape of its achievement. The film is a strange harmony, a narrative powered by compassion wrapped in violence, a visual world built from shadows and precision, and a financial structure engineered to be both daring and responsible. It blends these forces the way the protagonist blends quiet patience with lethal skill, never loudly, never theatrically, always with purpose. What stays with me most is not the choreography of the fights, nor the thunder of the action, but the way the film respects the emotional intelligence of its audience. It trusts us to sit in silence with the character, to feel the weight of his loneliness, to sense the history behind every controlled breath he takes before choosing to intervene. That trust is rare in modern cinema. Many films chase attention. This one invites contemplation. It asks us not just to watch violence, but to consider the moral cost of choosing to stop it. Technology in this film becomes a silent ally. The cameras whisper rather than shout. The sound design breathes rather than explodes. The lenses observe with clarity but never intrude. The editing follows the rhythm of thought rather than the rhythm of spectacle. These technical choices reveal a guiding philosophy: let the craft serve the emotion, not overpower it. And because of that restraint, every moment of impact feels earned. Every sound, every shadow, every strike becomes an expression of character rather than chaos. Economically, the film demonstrates something profound about the industry. In a landscape dominated by nine-figure blockbusters and massive franchises, this film carved out a space where mid-budget productions could still thrive, where grounded stories, practical locations, and psychologically rich characters could generate not just emotional resonance but real profit. It proved that audiences still hunger for narratives rooted in humanity, where the stakes feel personal, where justice feels intimate, where the world is not saved by spectacle but by one person daring to act. And beyond all the economic models and marketing strategies, there is the film's emotional legacy. It reminds us of the quiet people in our own lives. The ones who move gently, who listen more than they speak, who carry a stillness that seems deeper than silence. People who might hide their storms behind routines. People who might never show the full weight of their past. And it asks, what happens when such a person is pushed too far? What happens when kindness is met with cruelty? What happens when someone who wants peace is forced to become a weapon again? In that sense, the film holds up a mirror not just to its protagonist but to us. It reflects the part of us that longs for fairness in a world too often shaped by brutality. It reflects our desire to protect the vulnerable, even when systems fail to do so. And it reflects our belief that justice, even when imperfect, even when costly, still matters deeply. Cinema thrives in these contradictions, where art meets engineering, where emotion meets calculation, where human stories meet financial machinery. This film stands at that intersection with remarkable balance. It is built from shadows and spreadsheets, from lens physics and moral philosophy, from sound design and sorrow. And somehow, through all these layers, it maintains a soul. As the story fades into its final moments, the city returns to its quiet rhythm. Lights flicker. Streets empty. And somewhere in that solitude walks a man who has made peace with his purpose. He doesn't seek applause, nor recognition, nor glory. He simply steps forward, guided by his own internal compass, steady as ever. The film ends the way it begins, with quiet strength, with discipline, with the sense that justice does not need noise to exist. And so, my literature-loving friends, thank you for walking through this journey with me, through its art, through its technology, through its emotional architecture and financial machinery. If you found this deep dive meaningful, if you enjoyed peeling back the layers of craft and intention behind the film, then I invite you to stay with me for more. If you found this deep dive meaningful, my literature-loving friends, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep decoding the business and beauty of cinema together.